Sean Mize here for our Inner Circle and Signature training call today. I am really excited about what we're doing now as we're kind of progressing through the year. I want to give you just a little bit of background to what we're doing to kind of supplement things. So obviously, so many of you are just so used to hearing my voice and my cadence and that kind of thing in teaching so many of the things that I'm an expert at. But as I'm coaching you, as I'm teaching you, there are a few topics that I just don't know as well as other people do. And so one of the things that I'm doing over the course of the last few weeks, kind of going into this week, and probably will do the next few weeks, is I'm inviting folks that know more than I do to teach on some of these topics, not because I'm taking the day off, because you're going to see I'm here, okay? But because I want you to learn this at the level I'm learning. And a lot of times when I teach you something, I'm teaching you something I learned 6 months ago. I implement it, and then I teach you what I think is important. What some of the topics that we're doing right now are things that I believe that are important for you to do now. They're not important for you to wait for me to master it and then teach you. And so I encourage you. I know that we've done this in the past, and I've gotten complaints, because folks want to hear me teaching. But I want to share with you that I'm, out of good faith, I'm bringing someone on today that knows 10 times more than I do. And I promise that if you'll take notes, if you'll study, and you'll stay here through the end, that you'll get a much better instruction than if I had taught today. All right, so I'm really, really excited to have Bod Thibodeau here. Bod Thibodeau stands on his own and in his own right as an amazing podcast producer. When I introduce Bob in just a moment, I'm going to let him kind of tell you about that history and the amazing podcast that he's created. He had me on as a guest on his podcast about 1.5 years ago, and he is an amazing interviewer. And so if you want to learn how to interview, find a way to get on Bob's show, because what you'll learn just from having him interview you is amazing. But he is the rock solid deal. He's not a theoretician. He does this for real. Started the podcast show a few years ago, has an amazing audience. And again, at some point, he invited me to be a part. So I'm going to let you do all the details, Bob, for your own introduction, because you'll do a better job of it than I am. But I am just so excited to present to you Bod Thibodeau, podcasting expert.
I appreciate that, Sean. I'm so blessed to be here, everyone. And, I've learned so much from all of you over these last few years, and especially Sean, that, it took something that was just a random thought and actually has now narrowed down the focus to what we're doing today with our ministry and our podcast. Started in a form of podcasting back in 2008, late 2008, right in that area. And I didn't even know it was called a podcast back then. I just call it my online radio program. And about 3-4 months into it, I got an offer from a AM radio station conglomerate, Wilkins Communications, to go on AM radio. They said, "We've listened to your podcast." That's the first time I heard it called a podcast. And, we'd like you to go on nationwide AM radio. And I'm thinking, oh, absolutely. The one catch was I had to pay for it. And that was a little sticking point. But we negotiate out. I was on 4 major markets, and I learned so much about producing and quality and editing and loading the servers and all that about 6 months later, the Lord led us to start our own online radio station, which is evangelismradio.com. And it grew to #1 in the world in the Christian niche. Is rated by shoutcast.com. And the actual podcast that I have several podcasts, but the Kingdom Crossroads podcast started as a way for me to interview the broadcasters themselves. And it was just hit or miss. I might do 2 this month, none for 6 weeks, and then do 3 or 4, and then do 1, and then, But I got approached to interview an author about a new book release, and that really started what I'm doing now. I just enjoyed what I was doing, and so I've started interviewing authors, musicians, missionaries, business owners, anyone that is an influencer that has the Christian values as their base. Think Chick-fil-A. It's a secular business, but they're running it with Christian values. That's basically the niche that I've developed into. And we've had about 34,000 downloads. I mean, we're not a million downloads, podcast or anything like that. But the Ask Bob question and answer podcast that I started about 3-4 months ago, I just got a email yesterday from Chartable that was ranked number 2 down in Argentina. There's a couple other countries that are listed in there, but I thought that was probably kind of cool, that number 2 in our niche down there. But what I've learned from Sean over these past couple of years is how to narrow it down. Because I was looking at online marketing as a way of making extra income, but didn't really have a niche. And through the past couple of years, just realized, my lightning fast mind took about 2 years to figure it out, that, hey, what I'm doing is a niche. And so I started developing the podcast training program about a year ago, because I had been helping people all along for 2 or 3 years. They'd ask a question, I'd answer it. And then as with Sean's help, I finally realized that I'm answering the same questions individually almost all the time. So why not formulate that into a training program? And that's what I've done. Now, what really helped this business model grow for me was Sean's LinkedIn training that he was sharing with us for the past couple months. And I had been wondering how to implement LinkedIn, because I was on Facebook and didn't really get much success there. But I knew LinkedIn was a way to go. I just didn't know how to go about doing it. And with Sean's training, I started, let's see what happens. And it just took off. I mean, it's hard for me to even keep up with how much traction I'm getting now on LinkedIn. I had shared with Sean a couple weeks back that I had finally gone over 500 connections on LinkedIn. Over 3 years, I went to like 325, 340. And within a couple of weeks of implementing the training that he shared with us, I went over 500. I thought, man, this is great. Within the last 10 days, 12 days, something like that, I'm now over 650. Just so in less than a month, I've basically doubled the number of connections I've had on LinkedIn. And other than maybe 50 new connections, everyone else has been trying to connect with me because I started adding the value to other people's posts and posting things like that, and they would find me and connect with me. So what Sean's has been sharing with us on LinkedIn, as far as I'm concerned, it's just fantastic. And what I want to share with you today, first, can you see my screen? Is my screen up there about increasing traffic through podcasting? Can you see that, Sean? Anybody there?
Yeah, sure can. I had myself muted.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure that the screen was up there.
Yep,
okay.
Yep, all looks good. And Bob, by the way, I want to say thank you for sharing what you did, about how what I've shared with you recently has helped you, because I believe that is so powerful for others to hear. I think that sometimes it's hard for folks to sometimes take action on something because they go, wow, is this theory? But I want to say that about you, Bob, before you begin teaching. And I want to reiterate to everybody, a lot of folks that you're out there listening to and learning from, especially if they have a big team, a lot of times what they're teaching on their webinar may be accurate, it may be right, but for them, it's theory. For Bob, what he's going to show you today is the real deal, because he started from scratch a few years ago, and he's built up, and I don't know all the details, but in one niche area, he's the #1 podcast in the entire world. And you're talking with a champion here today, and you're able to see today the things that really work. So you let me speak, Bob. I took advantage of it. The ball's in your court again.
Amen. Well, I want to share with everyone some information on how to use podcasting to grow your audience. And come back over here. I don't know why that did that. It should be stepping. Where are we here? There we go. Okay. To grow your audience, grow your traffic, grow your brand, and grow your business. And you do it all through podcasting. And the best part is you don't even have to have a podcast to do it. It gives you a two-edged sword if you do, but some people aren't called to have a podcast. And, I understand that. And some of these statistics that I'm about to share with you will bear that out. But if you're not one of those who would benefit from having your own podcast, then why should you use podcasting as I'm going to talk about today? Well, great question. Just to put this point out there before I move on, you can be a guest on other people's podcasts. I mean, you can make these audiences aware of what you offer, audiences you would never have access to outside of that podcaster's listeners. What a concept, right? But first, I want to share with you some interesting statistics concerning podcasting. Now, think about these stats as it relates to whatever business niche you're currently marketing in. Podcasting has hit an accelerated growth pattern for the last several years. Back in 2015, iTunes reported that there was 206,000 podcasts listed on their platform. Apple Podcasts, formerly iTunes, reported in June of 2019, there were over 550,000 podcasts on that platform. It's estimated to be over 650,000 in 2020 and over 1 million by 2021. So what does all that mean to you? Well, first, those are big numbers. So let's make them a little bit smaller and more relevant, okay? 40% of those podcasts are dormant. What does that mean? It means the host that started the podcast either never really posted anything other than the first 1, 2, or 3 episodes, or quit around the 6-month mark. So let's take that $600,000 or 600,000 number and reduce it by 40% to about 360,000 active podcasts that you would compete with. And that's almost the total in the world. Almost every podcaster submits to iTunes. Okay. So depending on your niche, you could have a fairly open market, and you'll have to research that number, the podcasts that are in your particular niche using hashtags, categories, etc. For example, the example I gave at the beginning about being rated number 2 down in the nation of Argentina on my Ask Bob podcast was because I was listed in the how-to category, how to create a podcast category, and it was number 2 down there. Number 21 in another country, I can't think of it right off, but basically this is how you can find out where your competition is lying at. Now, for example, Buzzsprout, which is a popular podcast hosting company, reports the following statistics for 2018. Number 1 in the world is music with 61.1 million listeners. And you can see the other stats there, TV and movies, comedy, tech. And in addition to all that, you have all these different categories. Kids and family is 58.7 million, and science, 57.5 million, all the way down to business, both online and traditional. 52 million listeners are listening to business-related podcasts. And religion, of which one of my podcasts is part, has 49 million listeners. So what does all this mean? Well, I'm glad you asked. Let me summarize the impact podcasting is making in today's culture. Okay, here's some cool stats that I think are cool anyway. 80% of podcast listeners listen to all or most of each episode. Why is that important? Because you have your calls to action at the end, right? So if you have 80% of the listeners that are going to listen all the way through, they're going to hear your call for action. So if you have a little longer podcast, and we'll get into this, you might want to move your call to action up because the listenership will drop off as far as the length of the podcast is concerned. But I'll talk to that in a second. 64% of the United States population is familiar with the term podcasting. This is up 60% or from 60% in 2017. 17% or 48 million listeners listen to podcasts every week. That's up from 15% in 2017. 45% of monthly podcast listeners have household incomes above $75,000 versus 35% for the total population of the United States in general. So that means the podcast listeners also have some of that residual income, and if you're in business, those are the people you want to talk to. 27% of U.S. podcast listeners have a 4-year college degree versus just 19% for the U.S. population as a whole. 50% of all U.S. homes are podcast fans. That's from Nielsen ratings in August 2017. So half of all the homes in the United States listen to podcasts on a regular basis. 44% or 124 million people in the U.S. have listened to a podcast, up 40% from 2017. Up from 40% was what it was in 2017, so it's gone up to 44% now. And podcast listeners listen to an average of 7 different podcast shows every week. That's up from 5 in 2017. So podcasting is continuing to increase. Okay. Now let's talk about how you can and should use podcasting to grow your brand and grow your business. Okay. I've already shown you how quickly podcast is growing, and the expected growth is expected to continue each and every year. And when many people are stuck in the traditional methods of marketing, we have to take on the new and improved methods of doing things in order to be ahead of the competition. Those that are stuck doing the same old things will eventually come around to the new ways of doing them because they're better, cheaper, and faster. But if you're on the cutting edge and on the forefront, you're going to garner a lot of the business that everyone else will be trying to play catch up with. Okay. I want you to think about Henry Ford. When he broke the mold of having 10 men build one car each from start to finish, he was putting out on average 10 cars per week. But when he implemented the assembly line method, he started putting out 10 to 15 cars per day. And almost immediately it revolutionized the auto industry, and they still use the production line method today. That's what podcasting is doing to marketing today. In fact, large corporations are expected to drop over $1 billion into advertising in podcasts in 2020. Now, don't get your hopes up too high because they'll be dumping most of that money into about 1% of the podcasts that have millions of downloads per episode. But you can still use advertising in your podcast. And although that's not my topic today, I just want you to be aware of it. You can Google it and read all about it, about pre-roll, mid-roll, post-roll, and how to get those sponsors and things like that. That's not what we're here to talk about today. But I want to share with you how you can use a podcast to increase the amount of traffic you're sending to your website, and to your offers. Number one, you have to build relationships with your target audience. And we've been learning about interacting and providing value on LinkedIn and other places because that's the best way of generating traffic. There's no doubt about it, maybe other than word of mouth. And what I'm about to share with you is directed at those who have or are thinking of starting a podcast, but the information will still be valuable to those who just want to be part of other people's podcasts, to be guests on their podcast. And the reason I want you to understand what it is I'm sharing and why is because you need to know the how, what, and why of podcast marketing as well, because this will only help you in the long run if you understand these things. Now, we've been talking a lot about LinkedIn these past few weeks to build your brand and grow your audience. But how can you use a podcast to help you on LinkedIn? Well, it establishes credibility. If you have a podcast that is niched down to a specific audience, whether it's turning kids' clothes into quilts or how to get kids to do chores or how to sell ice to an Eskimo, somebody out there needs to hear about your ideas. And when you start a podcast, they don't do it to be long-winded. Okay, you have something to say, go ahead and say it, but don't get long-winded, especially if it's only you doing the talking. Statistics will bear this out, that the shorter each episode is, the more likely the listener will be to listen to all of the episode. And then the shorter it is, the more likely they'll be to binge listen multiple episodes. Take, for example, if you have a podcast that's 7 to 10 minutes right in that area, almost always it will be listened to all the way through, something like 85% of the time. Okay. If it's 7 to 10 minutes, it starts dropping off a little bit, about 68%. And why is that important? Again, that's where your call to actions are usually at. Okay. If you have a longer podcast and you only put your call to action at the end, people are going to know when you're starting to wrap up, or they're going to get bored with it and start logging off, and that you missed that opportunity. If you have a podcast that's about 15 minutes long, it drops to about 50% of the people listening will actually listen all the way through. 25 to 30 minutes, it drops to about 35%. And if it's 1 hour or more, it's under 20%. Okay. So also the number of episodes that you publish and how often you publish them will determine how much people will listen to. So the more you publish, then the shorter your episodes need to be. But if you're going to go a week or every 2 weeks before publishing an episode, you can go ahead and get away with a longer episode, because if you only publish once a week or every other week, the longer episode will be listened to more consistently because people are expecting it to be a little bit longer. And over time, your listening stats will increase. People expect it to last that long. They're expecting it to be published every other Monday or Wednesday. So you'll develop a following and they will begin to listen on a consistent basis. If you publish every other day or a couple times a week, you can get away with 30-minute episodes. But if you're publishing on a daily basis, try to build a loyal audience. Keep it under 10 or 15 minutes. By sharing each episode on LinkedIn, you forgot that I was talking about LinkedIn, Tyke. Is that right? Okay. You generate credibility again. Once you get to 30 or 40 episodes being published and you're doing it on a consistent basis, you'll start to be seen on LinkedIn as an expert in the eyes of some of the people. And you can continue to reach out to the influencers in your niche, as we've been learning about through Sean. And you need to comment and like and share their posts and their articles, asking nothing in return. Just build that value. That's how I started doing it, just like we were taught. And like I said, out of 150 new connections or more, I think I actually only tried to connect with maybe 50 people, and that was the first week. Everyone else, when I started commenting and sharing and liking and just adding value, if somebody had a question or they made a post, and I would, talk about it and share it. And when I shared it on my platform, I'd tag them in the process. You started building these connections. Other people are seeing their posts. They see what you're sharing and they start reaching out to you. And that's what's happened to me. I get probably 10 to 15 new contacts, it seems like, every day. Now I go through them and there's some that are, that's a little shady. I'll decline that one. But it's doubled my impact just in a month. So you can continue to reach out to the influencers in your niche, as we've been learning, but you need to make sure you like, comment, and share their posts. Do not try and sell. Don't try and talk about your coaching program or anything else. Just build value. And as people see who you are, they'll see your podcast episodes as well, because they're going to reach out, they're going to research you, and then they're going to try and connect with you just because you're a podcaster. Or they'll reach out to you because they see you are guesting on other podcasts. And that's why it's important for you, if you're a guest on somebody else's podcast, you need to share that with your following as well. So I know this because I experience, as I said, almost on a daily basis. Now, I shared about how I went from 500 to now 650. Folks, this works. I just can't emphasize that enough. LinkedIn is hot right now for this, and it especially works if you can establish your credibility either as a host of a podcast willing to do interviews or offering to guest post on other people's interviews, which leads me to the second way to increase traffic: using podcasts. How podcasting can help you to be the expert that will help them. Okay. So the question that I hear all the time, and I'm sure Sean has heard it because we've heard him teach on this subject: why would anyone want to listen to me? Well, that's the question almost every podcaster, speaker, and even online marketers have asked. Why would anyone want to listen to what I have to say? As I stated above, no matter what niche you're in, you have something to share that nobody else has. You have experiences that are unique only to you. I was doing an interview yesterday on a person's podcast, and I was giving a couple of my Army stories, and he said, when I write my next book, I want to interview you because you've got some great stories. But see, we established that connection, and that's how that works. So you have to take those experiences and turn them into a positive that will set you apart from others. Most people, they think they don't have anything worthwhile to say. But the truth is, they believe they do not have anything worthwhile to say. That's a big difference, okay? An expert is considered someone who, by virtue of their education, training, skill, experience, is believed by others to have expertise or knowledge beyond the skill of the average person. So let's take a look at those areas, and I'll give you some idea of how you can be defined as an expert and drive more traffic through LinkedIn and increase your business. First, it's by virtue of education. Doctors, lawyers, teachers, CPAs, etc. Because of the education they've received and the degrees that they've earned, they are automatically considered to have credibility and are considered experts over and above the average person. Next is by virtue of skills. They've developed, skills over the course of time, like car mechanics or scuba divers or golfers or musicians or athletes. They all have skills developed over the years that the average person just does not have. Follow that up with training. For example, the military or law enforcement, firefighters, just to name a few. These people have been trained to be experts in their areas. This training is not normally provided to the general public. When I was a police officer, I was certified in both district court and circuit court in the state of Maryland as an expert in DUI traffic stops and the field sobriety tests and everything that goes on with that. I specialized in that area. It was all based upon the training that I'd received and then the implementation of that training over and over and over and over and over again. After a while, the people who are implementing and working based upon the training they've received will become experts as compared to the general population. In fact, if I was in court and I was questioned, I would preface my answer with, based upon my training, knowledge, and experience, this is what happened. And that was what helped get me recognized, formally certified as an expert for law enforcement. Speaking of which, there is a virtue of experience. These folks may not have specific degrees, the expert training or the skills that others may have, but they have been doing something successfully for many years. They have the experience to teach others what they've learned. When I started in podcasting, I basically self-taught myself for the first 2 years or so, and I made all kinds of mistakes. All along the way, not only did I learn what to do, but more importantly, I learned what not to do. And that was actually more valuable. And now I share that knowledge with people starting their podcasting journey. So, where are you as an expert? There are basically 3 types of experts. Are you the scholarly type? The type that, there we go. The type that, you have the degrees and the certifications, like doctors, lawyers, and things like that. There is an audience needing your wisdom so they can get better. Are you a guide? Are you so familiar with the terrain that clients are going to travel that you can show them the way? You can show them the shortcuts. You can show them what perils await them and how to avoid them. You know these things because you've traveled this path many times. Or are you what they consider a traveler? You may not have all the answers. You may not have the degrees of the scholar. You may not have the experiences of the guide, but you have empathy and the well-being of your listeners at heart. You want to walk the path with them. You don't know the path. You don't know the pitfalls that await, but you're willing to walk the path with your client, to support them, to learn with them, to support, be a guide to each other. You'll have a relationship with your listeners and clients that'll be closer than any scholar or guide could provide. An example would be someone who is finally fed up with being overweight and out of shape. So they're going to start their own little Facebook group where they're going to support each other in losing weight and getting fit over the next 12 months or whatever. And you don't have certifications in that area. You're not trained in that area. You just decide, this is going to be my new lifestyle. I'm going to change it. And I want to help others and they can help me. We can be a support group for each other and encourage each other whenever there's a fallback. And that's what I'm talking about here as a traveler. You may not be certified in it. You may not have experience in it, but you decided this is what we're going to do. And anybody want to go with me? And then you'll help each other along the way. But only you can decide where you're at. What type of expert are you? Okay, because that's how you will need to position yourself to your audience and also to other podcasters. Now, you cannot be a traveler pitching a scholarly podcast and trying to be a guest on their podcast. The host will not consider you an expert for his or her audience. In the same light, a scholarly podcaster may talk above a guide or traveler's audience and would not be considered a right fit for them. So you need to identify what role your expert status is. This will help you to pitch yourself as an expert to your niche and to other podcasters. Why do I keep talking about pitching yourself to other podcasters? Well, that brings me to the main point that I wanted to make with this training. You need to leverage other people's audiences to increase traffic and grow your business. If you guest on other people's podcasts and share what you're doing in their business, in your business with their audience, you are doing 3 things. First, you have to bring value to the other person's audience. They trust you to do so. Do not make it about your offer. Do not make it about what you can do. You must give value, and I mean give value away. You need to share, just like Sean does, some top-level information that you normally would charge your clients for. You don't need to give away the crown jewels, so to speak, but you should be willing to part with some pearl necklaces, okay? The podcaster is doing all the work. They're putting in the effort of making each podcast episode so they can bring great value and help their audience. They've built their loyal audience over time. And when they invite you to be on their podcast and talk to their audience, it is for that purpose only. It's not to help you grow your business. It's to help their audience. So do not disappoint, okay? When I started to do is I create now, because I've implemented this all about the same time I started the LinkedIn process of growing my influence. What I started to do is create an individual page for each podcast that I am interviewed on. This is something, like I said, I just started about a month ago, and it has worked great. Each page looks almost exactly the same, but nobody knows that because I'm talking to a different audience each time. But I create also a short, maybe a 1.5 to 2 minute video, basically thanks the podcaster by name, mentioning the podcast, welcoming that person's audience to my website. And I explain that this offer is just for them. And again, I create this as a hidden page. It's not visible on my menu. When people land on the main website, they can't find it. I provide the podcaster the unique URL just for their page to share with their audience. And I copy and paste the information to a new page and make necessary corrections so I can make it unique to every podcast and podcaster that I'm dealing with. Now, this is an example of what that page will look like. I know it's hard to read because I had to shrink it down in order to fit it on the slide, but don't worry, you'll get the real page for Sean's training today at the end. But I want to emphasize that this is something that is so easy to do, and you just include it in a separate section on your website, and it's hidden, so the general public can't find it. And what I do is I give away the content that I promised. No opt-in required. For me, it's a podcast creation checklist. I explain if they follow the checklist in sequence, when they finish, they will have their podcast up and running. And then they can click the link. It takes them directly to that page. They can download it, save it, whatever they need to do. I do not even ask for an email. And I do that on purpose. But after I explain what the podcast creation checklist will do for them, I then mention I'll also give to them my Podcast Made Easy ebook that follows along with the checklist and explains each step a little bit more in detail. And then I also explain that on my website, it sells for $37. But if they want the ebook, just click the link, tell me where to send the ebook. As a listener to so-and-so's podcast, I want to provide that to them for free. And that's where I get their contact information email. I may have, 50, 60 people download the free checklist and 10 or 15 take the ebook. But would you rather have, 100 contact emails that want really nothing to do with what you're offering, or take 10 or 15 that, they're interested in a little bit deeper level connection with you? Okay. That's my theory behind that. But either way, the podcaster is looking at this as great value for their audience. And that's the end of my offers. No pitching, no selling. Okay. I've accomplished my goal, getting their info so I can continue to build a relationship with that small minority who are interested in building a relationship with me. Not to sell them, but to build a relationship one day at a time in my email sequence. And in my email sequence for the podcast creation checklist, I go 8 or 9 days with no offers whatsoever. I'm just building the relationship, walking them through the checklist, giving a little bit more detail. By the time I get to day 10 or 12, then the soft offers start. Okay. By day 13 and 14, I'm a little more blunt in the offer, not forceful, but I'm not tiptoeing around it any longer either. And I've gotten some people registered for my training using this method. Remember, these are people you would never have any contact with if it were not for this person's podcast. So how do you become a guest on other people's podcasts? Again, remember, it's all about the relationship. I mean, you could pitch 200 different podcasters with, hey, I see you're a podcaster. Can I be interviewed on your podcast? Maybe 5 might take you up. I may be few more than that, but you get the point. But if you take 3 or 4 weeks of going to their LinkedIn profile, their Facebook page, their Twitter feeds, just commenting and sharing their posts and being sure you tag them in it and leave great value, great comment like, I never thought of what you were saying in that light before. This is great. And you're sharing it with your audience and you tag them in it. You're building that value and it'll be a step in the right direction. But you need to go one step further than just that. As I said, podcasters love to see reviews about their podcast and their episodes. And to be honest, it is truly a rare occasion when someone leaves a review. Don't ask me how I know. But unlike blog posts or Facebook posts, most podcasters do not receive a notification when someone does leave a comment on their episodes or on iTunes or Apple Podcasts. But they do check for them. It may not be every day. I know I only go through the steps required to check for comments probably every week or so. But I'm telling you, these podcasters do check. So if you are in the relationship building mode after 1 or 2 weeks of commenting on LinkedIn and Facebook and sharing their posts and leaving little comments of value that will help someone answer a question on their site, something like that, go to their podcast site and listen to 2 or 3 episodes. Just don't go in there and say, oh, great episode, and you share it, or that's the comment you leave. That means nothing. Listen to a couple episodes, leave comments of value, a takeaway, 1 or 2 takeaways that you received by listening to that episode. So they know you listened to it and they appreciate that. Listen to 2 or 3 of them and leave a comment in the show notes. Don't blow smoke. Be honest. If you didn't like the podcast, don't be honest about that. But be honest as far as finding something to give a positive comment about. Hey, great content. I never thought of that before. Or I had not a thought along those lines concerning this before, something like that. And then if you go over to their podcast on iTunes, I keep calling it iTunes, it's now called Apple Podcasts, leave a rating and a review. If you do that, if you have been commenting and sharing and building value on their Facebook page or Twitter feed, their LinkedIn posts, and building that relationship, then you go over and you start leaving comments on their podcast episodes, showing that you've gotten takeaways from every one of them. And then you go to Apple Podcasts and find their podcast and leave a rating and a review. I guarantee you have their attention, because that's something that they do not see on a frequent basis. So when you get someone who's played all 3 bases, I guarantee you have their attention. Even if they were happy with you commenting on LinkedIn or Facebook, they'll be thrilled when you start liking and commenting and sharing an episode or 2 from their podcast. And then when you leave a great review and rate on Apple Podcasts, you'll become one of their best buds, guaranteed. And this is the easiest way to stand out from the crowd and get their attention. But don't pitch them just yet. This may seem like an anticlimactic thing, but you are building them up where it will be very easy for them just to say yes, okay? Continue to interact with them even for a few more weeks. You'll notice they start replying and commenting on your posts. Then when you get to that point, soft pitch them about being a guest. What does that mean? Wait for them to post something that you've already covered in your podcast or in a training you developed or in a book you may have published, and just say something to the effect, hey, I noticed that hey, Joe, I've seen you answer this question before or ask this question or someone asked you a question about this. I covered this a few weeks back, or I wrote an ebook about this a couple months ago, or I published a book about this last year. I'd be happy to share these points with your listeners. In fact, I'll give your listeners the ebook for free if that would help your audience out. Now, if you've done your job correctly up to this point, Joe is probably going to say, oh, heck yeah. And if he should say no, don't take it personally. Just acknowledge it. Say something like, hey, no problem, Joe. I understand the timing may not be right for you right now, but hey, this is a standing offer. Just let me know anytime. And then continue interacting with Joe. Keep sharing value with his audience. That way he sees that you weren't just doing this to try and get on his podcast. Okay? It may take 6 more months, but eventually Joe's going to come around. And you can always ask Joe to be a guest on your podcast if you have one. Then it becomes something of a reciprocal guesting podcast, and that works too. But it has to be the right fit for your audience as well as theirs, okay? But don't just stop with the podcast, okay? I want you to think about this. If you've prepared for your interview, either as a guest or as a host, you've provided great value and service. You've sat down with an industry icon or expert for 30 minutes, 45 minutes, even 60 minutes in some cases. Either way, you have unprecedented access to this person and or their audience for an extended period of time. That's valuable. That is absolutely valuable. If you were a guest on their podcast, then you provided great value to their audience, and the host is really appreciative. If you're the host, the guest that you had on your podcast has blown away your audience with their expertise, their tips, their value as well. Either way, both of you are pleased with the result. Now, the biggest mistake you can make is to say the normal things after the interview is done. Well, thank you for your time. I'll share this episode on my social media. I hope you do the same, blah, 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 blah. Goodbye. You just tapped the mind of an industry expert. This person set aside almost a whole hour of uninterrupted access to you. Think about that. You have had access that some people would pay thousands of dollars for. And if you've done your job well and prepared for the show properly, they are impressed with you. Your job now is to continue to build the relationship. So what should you do after the interview is over? Well, I'm talking about the recorded portion. Ask if you can have their mailing address, or if you have it already from your research on their website and all that, you can skip this, but send them a physical thank you card. This is something that's not normally done today. With email being so easy, everybody gets a thank you email. But to receive a physical card 2, 3, 4 days later, it's going to bring you to the remembrance, and you stand out because you're doing something that hardly anybody else has done with them. You can also send them a physical copy of your book if you have one. I don't do this as often as I should, but I'm getting better at it now because I understand what this concept is. Just make sure that it's a fit for the person you're sending it to. Either way, it's something that others usually do not do. This, again, will keep you to the forefront of their memory. And once the recording part is over and you're in the process of closing the interview down, tell them how much you enjoyed it. Rave about the information they provided. Then ask them if there's anything you can help them with. And the important part is, mean it. If they say, well, I was kind of thinking about this, go the extra mile and help them, whatever that situation might be. Sometimes they may just take you up on it. In those cases, go out of your way to make sure that what you're going to do for them is valuable. That will stick in their mind as well. It may be something simple, something you could do in 10 minutes. But if it's something that's beyond your ability, don't blow smoke at them. Tell them, that's something I'm not really sure what I do, and I'd feel bad leading you down the wrong path. Tell them it's okay, but don't promise to do something and then not do it, because that will stick in their memory as well. And then before you hang up, ask if it's okay if you refer them to another podcaster that you would feel would be a good fit for them. I mean, you don't want to refer them to just anyone, okay? This is someone that you should be trusting. Someone that you trust will make a good impression on this person. It could be someone in their same niche. It could be another podcaster who does interviews. Just make sure that is a good fit with the person's expertise and level of authority. Simply send an email introducing each of them to each other. I usually say something like this. Hey, John, I would like to virtually introduce you to Jack. I interviewed Jack on my podcast last week. Jack is an expert in XYZ. He completely blew my listeners away with the value that he provided. I thought about you and how you would be a great fit to interview Jack as well. So Jack, meet John. John, meet Jack. If only, and then I put parentheses, if only virtually. Then stay in touch with them from time to time. If you see them being interviewed in an article or on TV or on another podcast, send them an email. Tag them in Facebook. Just don't do it every single day. Okay, you don't want to be considered a stalker or anything like that. but just from time to time. It keeps you in their mind, and they realize that you're still providing value without asking anything from them in return. That elevates your relationship to a level they usually do not experience with others that they've interviewed with. Send them another referral from time to time. Just nurture that relationship that you've established. Don't let it go to waste. And if you want to be guests on other people's podcasts, there are numerous lists that you can get on that will provide you with the information. Some are free. Some charge a small monthly fee, like $6 or $7 a month. I have a few listed here that I'm on. And folks, it keeps me filled with guests. I spend about $20 per month total, but it keeps my schedule full for doing interviews. And now with the LinkedIn list, I used to, when I first started doing this, I would do a weekly podcast. And when I started doing interviews, that quickly was growing what I had in my hopper. And at one point in time, I had about 5 months ahead. Like if this was January, I'd be telling people, well, your podcast will air in May. And that just didn't sit right with me. So I started doing 3 times a week. That cut it down where I was about 6 weeks ahead. So then I started doing a daily release on my podcast. And that cut it down to a week to 10 days, which was great. Because of what LinkedIn has been doing with me right now, I am, with the interview I just did today, I'm now 4 weeks out on my interview schedule list, which means the person I interviewed today, I told him to be the last week of December or the first week of January before his interview would be aired. So what I'm going to do is over the Christmas holidays, I'm more or less going to not do any interviews, just work on my website and the business plan and things like that to let that bleed off a little bit, because you don't want to get so far out there that, they're releasing a book on December 15th and their interview will not air with you until, February. You don't want that. Okay. So you just need to make sure that when you start getting these interview requests or these people that are listed on these programs here, the interview guest directory, podcast guests, radio guest list, spot guest, when you reach out to them, you don't want to get so booked that you are not going to be able to provide relevant, timely information to them. Okay. So you can get on these lists. Like I said, some are free, some charge a small fee, but these have kept my schedule full. I've got going on 620 episodes of my podcast right now. I've done about 450 different interviews over the last 2.5 years. So this does work. Anyway, in summary, podcast listenership is estimated to increase about 15% every year. It's huge right now. It may not be that way in 5 years. I mean, blogging was big about 10 years ago, not so much anymore. So use the popularity now to build your business. And then when the next big thing comes along, you'll be in position to transition to that. But until then, use the popularity of podcasting to build your audience, build your contact list, build your expert status, build your brand, build your business. Recently, car companies started including the USB ports and all that. And if they had the screen in the car, a podcast button that can be pushed so you can listen to your favorite podcast while driving. So this is now a big thing because as people are driving to work, that's 30, 45 minutes. They know they can get in 1 or 2 of their favorite podcast episodes. You need to tap into that market. I just recently recorded entire training on how to use LinkedIn's algorithm to build your brand and business. And before I put together this training program, what I'm doing now, I dug deep, everything I could find on LinkedIn's algorithm. And I made that as part of my offer for my podcast training people. It's included as a bonus to the 9 video training I have that walks you from start to finish in podcast training. And it's offered on my website. With Sean's permission, this link will take you to the page that I described previously, created just for Sean's audience today. Unlike the normal pages I use when I do interviews, though, for this group, I wanted to offer you this LinkedIn training on the algorithm I did as an additional bonus for free. You'll be including, the podcast creation checklist, the podcast made easy ebook, all that I talked about, and also include a link to the page that will give the 4 places you can go and 5 podcast guests that are looking for guests to be on their podcast. And you can even take out an ad and put your name out there that you want to be interviewed or you're looking for people to interview. I've done that on those things as well. So if one is in the niche that you serve, contact the host and tell them what you're able to offer. Ask if you can be a guest. 90% of the time, they're going to say yes, because that's the reason they're advertising on that list, okay? Now, if you have any questions about podcasting, you go to my website, podcast-training.com, and use the contact form. As I mentioned, I also have a podcast called Ask Bob, and you can ask a question through that contact form. And if I use your question on the podcast, I have a neat bonus that I usually send out. All of that information is available on the website. The podcast website is askbobpodcast.com. That's one for my questions and answers. And you can look at the questions that I've already answered. I may have already covered the question that you have. So go there and check it out. It's all for free. I've learned so much from Sean over these last few years, and I was honored when he asked me to share all of this information with you. I just want to be a blessing where I can, and I want to see each of us grow our business in 2020 to levels that we only dreamed about before. Dreams that we're just starting to see come now over the horizon. So I'll leave it there. Sean, back to you, my friend.
Well, Bob, that was awesome. That was absolutely amazing. And I'll tell you what I'd love to hear from everybody that's live for this. If you type into the chat the one thing that you appreciate that Bob has shared with you today. I'll tell you, Bob, I want to share first of all, before I read any of the comments, what meant the most to me was if you can leave that screen up, if that's possible, that would be great. Okay. I'd love for folks to be able to kind of see, and I think that I put the link in where folks can get that information. But if it's okay with you, I'd love to have that screen still up.
Okay.
So I'll tell you the thing that just really impresses me about you, Bob, and this is something that's impressed me for years, but obviously you've amped it up these last couple of months, and that is the power of relationships. You know, the fact that when you build relationships with other people, when you ask other people if you can be interviewed on their show, or you ask them to interview on your show, you're building these long-term relationships, and you're getting referral traffic to your website. I love the fact that you were kind of talking about this idea of not going out there and just sugarcoating it and trying to do tit for tat and trying to make a review so somebody will get you on their show, but that this is honest, and it's long-term, and it's loyal, and it's about building long-term relationships. And I just love to hear you say that. That's just so very, very important. I want to read through these comments, Bob. And now that we've got those comments in, folks, if you've listed a comment, all right, and I'm going to do this a little differently than I normally do. If you don't have anything good to say about what Bob has taught, then I don't want questions yet. Okay, you'll have your opportunity later. For right now, if you appreciated what Bob just shared, but you have a question for him, if you'll type that into the chat box, that would be awesome. Yvonne says that's a really great strategy that Bob mentioned, implementing on the podcast. You're being interviewed today. An initial offer with no opt-in, followed by additional offer with an opt-in. And so that's really powerful. You know, and I think one of the things that you hit on, Bob, that's so important is this idea. You know, a lot of folks don't want you offering an opt-in on their podcast. They're doing this as a service to you. The fact of the matter is, everybody's website should be so sticky, it should be so amazing that people want to opt in. Like, you know, if I send somebody over to my website, I don't have to say, and oh, by the way, while you're there, opt in. If you're not attracted to the offer I have on the front page of my website, we're probably not a good fit for each other. All I've got to do is give my URL, and that's all that I need to do. Cynthia says, amazing. Lloyd says, wow. Doria says, thank you. Michael says, great stuff, everything.
Amen.
Dr. Bruce says, I really appreciate hearing how you build relationships with people. And, you know, folks, I know that some of you, once again, I'll probably get some criticism emails for having a few different folks on recently. I'm assuming those are going to be from people who just don't want to soak things in. But I'll tell you, when you get to hear it from multiple voices, you get to hear a different level. I was talking with someone today, and what I teach, I can do it in my sleep. I just understand these things at a deep, deep level, and I'm not bragging or anything like that. But some of these things I understand at such a deep level, I have a really hard time getting it onto a sheet of paper. I mean, you know, some of these things have 1,000 moving parts. And for me to try to put that in a logical fashion on a piece of paper, I just struggle with that. And I know there's some smart people out there that like to use mind maps and things, but mind maps I just have a really hard time creating a mind map. Mind maps are amazing when I look at somebody else's. I look at it for 3 seconds and it's like a picture's worth 1,000 words. But my mind is like a big mind map when it comes to a lot of what I teach. And so when you folks are willing to step up and teach and really teach how what I do integrates with what you do, then it really allows other people to learn at a higher level and a new level. So Rick says, so many resources. Cynthia says, number one to implement now, love the gifts with no opt-in. So that's a big deal, Bob, that's really powerful. Paul says opt-in strategy. Bio says the no commitment baby step opt-in and then the soft invitation offer. So it sounds like that was a hot thing today, Bob. Yvonne appreciated it, especially the significance of sending the interview a physical card. And that's huge. And that really is huge. Bruce says, that was an amazing presentation, Bob. I love how you led us through the strategy, basically just listening, caring, paying attention to the needs of others. Cynthia, number one for long-term good specific information on building relationships.
Thanks, everybody.
Relationship building process. Thank you. Cards really do work. Love that it was quick and to the point, seemed to flow very well. Cool. 2 offer idea from Norman. Once again, the opt-in and one without. Appreciate the step-by-step instructions for going out about how to get interviewed. And of course, that's your area of expertise. Tina, love the opt-in and agree. Tina is literally pulling an all-nighter because it was 2 a.m. a few hours ago. And wow. She said she was going to pull an all-nighter, and here she is. She's still here.
I appreciate it.
Bob highlights the act of serving people, not just trying to sell them. So all of that is so powerful. Any questions for Bob? And so while you folks are typing questions in, if there's anything, I want to say, Bob, thank you so much for sharing this. It was a pleasure. Of course, a year and a half, couple years ago, whatever it was, when I was on your podcast. And, I just love to hear what you've done recently with kind of taking that LinkedIn strategy and being able to meet new people. And I'll say this, Bob, I believe that you're right at the very beginning of a huge power curve. You're building relationships that are going to pay off in 3 to 6 months. And I just believe you're right at the tip of the big explosion.
I appreciate the opportunity. I just enjoyed myself today. It was awesome.
Awesome. That's cool. That's really cool. Well, I'm really excited about what you're doing, Bob. Obviously, this works for you and me both because it allows me to change lives by giving exposure to people that are better than me. And obviously, it creates exposure for you. And folks, I just say this 100%. If you choose to start learning from Bob about podcasts, and I know there's other folks out there that teach, and we don't want to take anything away from them. Bob and I were talking about a couple of them the other day. There's folks out there that do this for a living, that do this at a higher level than Bob does, obviously, and have absolutely amazing training. The wonderful thing that I like about Bob is that he's in the trenches right now. He doesn't have an assistant of an assistant reaching out to 1,000 people each week and then trying to scour through and choose the one person that has the biggest following to do something with. I mean, Bob's out here in the trenches. He's talking to real people on a regular basis. He started from scratch recently. And I think sometimes when that happens, when you have somebody that's real like that, it's easier for you to connect and to relate to what they're doing than if you're going to somebody's show that, hey, they're bona fide getting 100,000 downloads a week or something like that. They're getting a really big name in the industry. The problem is, you buy their training program. And again, I'm not knocking the program. Their training programs are amazing, right? But what happens is I see psychologically, a lot of times you get the program and you start learning, and then you hit this wall and you're like, well, I can't get so-and-so on my podcast, and I can't do this and I can't do that. And now we're saying I can't. We get into this mindset that says, well, I can't do what the person did that's teaching me. And then you lock up. And we all know that it happens. I've been there. I lock up. I try to learn something new. I lock up. You learn something new. You lock up. The beautiful thing is, and I'm telling you this, I won't be able to say this 5 years from now about Bob, because Bob is going to be light years ahead of where he's at. But right now, if you're in the trenches, if you want to build in the trenches, Bob's a great person to get to know a little bit better. So I'm not seeing any other questions. Bob, is there anything you'd like to add?
No, like I said, this training was what I have learned over the past month, and I hope that it's able to be a blessing to people and they can grow their business through podcasting as well.
Okay, awesome. And I would say that obviously what you've learned in the last month has augmented and kind of pushed you to a new level. But I mean, really what you're able to teach comes from the roots of experience that's happened over the last couple of years. And I'm so excited about that as well. So folks, again, askbobpodcast.com or podcast-training.com. You can get some amazing training there. To everybody that says thanks, and some of you looks like maybe you've checked out the checklist. Norma says the checklist is awesome. So I'm really excited about everything that you're doing, Bob. Thanks again for being here on my show.
Amen.